We all have our dark sides, and we all have our tragedies. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is season 4, episode 12. And last week we discussed the Edgar Allan Poe story, The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather. So this week we thought we would delve deeper into Poe's body of work by looking at the new anthology edited by Dahlia Adler titled His Hideous Heart, 13 of Edgar Allan Poe's most unsettling tales reimagined, including the original tales. So last week we had our 100 episode celebration, and we decided that we were going to look at a bit of horror history that debuted 100 years ago. And we looked at the movie The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And Mel actually brought up the Edgar Allan Poe story, The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather, and made some comparisons between Caligari and the Poe story. And after that, we thought, we really haven't discussed too in depth Poe and his work on this podcast. And I know I, for one, am a big fan of Edgar Allan Poe. Mel, I know you are as well. We've both done work with his stories in our academic careers. And Mel, you actually brought up this idea of this new anthology, His Hideous Heart. So just a little bit of information about this for listeners who are interested, because I think you're going to want to pick up this anthology. This is out from Flatiron Books, and it came out, I believe, in September of 2019. And basically what it is it's a collection of 13 stories that are all based on Poe stories. So they're modern day authors who have taken classic Poe stories and reimagined them and in some cases modernized them. Not all of them are modern takes on it. But they've taken these stories and they've repackaged them and repurposed them for new audiences. But the cool thing about this anthology is that it actually puts together these new stories with the original Poe stories, so you can kind of see them one to one. It makes it really interesting. But before we jump in, I wanted to read a little bit from Dahlia Adler's introduction, because I think she does a really good job in describing what the aim of this book is. So she writes, "It's a tall order, running off of those feelings, those memories, and trying to both recapture them and reimagine them into something new. This collection is a way to honor the work of Edgar Allan Poe, but it's also a way to view it through different gazes, to take classic literature with its relatively homogeneous perspectives and settings and give them new life. What I learned from editing this collection was how much changing those aspects of a story can affect the greater picture, how you can maintain so many of a story's themes, but find entirely new motivations by centering characters from society's margins, characters who seldom got to be Poe's heroes." All right, so that's what Adler had to say about His Hideous Heart. Mel, I'm really glad that you suggested that we read this one, because I really enjoyed reading it.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I mean, you know me, Lisa, we took a class on Edgar Allan Poe with a Poe expert when we were in graduate school. So we have read a lot of Poe, and I enjoy him very much. I've taught a few of his stories. I've done The Telltale Heart several times in American Lit Surveys, but I have also taught, The Fall of the House of Usher, and William Wilson, and a couple others in a horror themed class that I used to teach a couple universities ago in the past. And I love his stuff. He is so good at, I think, making us realize like the horror he talked in his own writing about horror that horror isn't always something outside of you. It's not always what people thought it was in like Gothic novels, that horror could also come from within. And I think that's one of the things that I take from his horror is that we can be just as scared of a faceless person coming after us, or we can be just as scared of a person that means us harm. But we also need to pay attention to what could be scary, like in our own minds and our own hearts. And so this idea of like the awareness of the human potentiality for evil, I think, is one of the things that's most terrifying about him. But I think anyone who's read Poe extensively, and especially knows the time period that he was writing in, in the 19th century in America, knows that some of his work could be problematic. As Adler points out in her introduction here, it's very much that kind of classic literature homogeneity. And one of the things I think is really cool about this particular book is that it reimagines these stories, as she puts it, in different places, from schools to camps to suburban neighborhoods. There's a couple that are kind of set almost in fantasy locations, which is a little bit Poe-esque, but it also has really interesting heroes and main characters. So I encourage listeners, we're only going to be able to talk about a couple of the stories that we enjoyed, but the stories, it's very enjoyable to read them, and it's also enjoyable to go back and read the original Poe story. There were a couple Poe stories in here I had to go back and reread just to kind of refresh myself, so I could see how the modern retelling went. And it was really cool to know that those Poe stories were in the back of this book, and I didn't have to go dig up my old textbook, which I still have. I used it in the last episode when we talked about Tar and Feather. Let me see. Before we started recording, Lisa, you and I were talking about a couple of the stories that we had been texting about before this while we were reading. And like I said, listeners, we don't want to spoil too much for you. So we're only going to talk about a couple probably. I don't know about you, Lisa, but I'm thinking we should start with The Glittering Death by Caleb Roehrig, I guess it was how you pronounce his name, which is a modern retelling of The Pit and the Pendulum.
I'm so ready to talk about the story.
Should we give a brief summary of The Pit and the Pendulum, or just get into the Glittering Death?
let's go ahead, and like we said, listeners, we are going to encourage you to go out and buy this book or find it at your local library, and read it yourself. We will be giving spoilers for the stories that we're talking about, but we're only going to talk about a couple of them so that the rest of the book you can read unspoiled. But I do want to go ahead and stress that, since this is a book that did just come out a few months ago, even though The Pit and the Pendulum is, if we're spoiling The Pit and the Pendulum for you, then you're, too late on that one. But this book did only come out a few months ago. So we're just going to warn you that a couple of these stories we are going to spoil. And if you don't want them spoiled, then just pause this and go buy the book, because it's well worth it. But Mel, why don't you go ahead and give a kind of rundown of The Pit and the Pendulum, the Poe story, just so all of our listeners are on the same page.
Okay. So in The Pit and the Pendulum, which was one of the ones that I had to refamiliarize myself with, you have our main character who is a narrator. So again, kind of an unreliable Poe narrator. He has been sentenced by the Inquisition, so these moral judges, to death, we assume. I don't think he actually says. And he wakes up and he finds himself in this extremely dark room. He can't see anything. And so he starts walking around the room trying to figure out where he is. And gradually, their kind of plans for him to stumble and kill himself in really hideous ways don't work. So at the center of this dark room, there's a pit that goes very far down and has water and tons of rats in it. And he just happens to fall down and not next to the pit, and his arm is like there, and he realizes it's there, so he stays away from it. So then they turn the light on, and if I remember correctly, he's like super thirsty at that point. And so they start giving him like water and bread, and he wakes up. They're like drugging him with all the food that they give him and the water that they give him. And at one point he wakes up and he's like tied down to a gurney, and there's this pendulum, like a clock pendulum with this super sharp bottom, and it's swinging back and forth and it's coming down into the chamber with him. So it takes forever as he just sits there watching it go back and forth. And eventually it's going to go across his chest and cut him open, but it'll take forever. Like it'll fray his clothes and then a little bit more, a little bit more. Meanwhile, he's like trying everything he can to get out. He's attracting the rats to the bindings to try to get them to chew him out. He gets off. He thinks maybe he's okay, and then they start manipulating the walls of the chamber, almost like the trash compactor in Star Wars. Apparently, they're like trying to push him into the pit, basically. And then there's like this almost like Deus Ex Machina ending where this military comes and they stop the folks who are trying to hurt him, and they reach in and they like grab him right before he falls to his death in the pit, and that's the end of the story. So, Lisa, do you want to get us started on our discussion of this reinterpretation of the Pit and the Pendulum?
Yes. I'm really, I mean, the Pit and the Pendulum, I'll just go ahead and say this. This is probably one of the first Poe stories that I read on my own as a child. My dad had one of those old Edgar Allan Poe collections, probably from when he was in high school or college, that just had all of them in it. And one day I had picked it up. I mean, I was probably like 11 years old, and read The Pit and the Pendulum, and it's a terrifying story on its own. So I was really excited to get to this one in the collection, The Glittering Death, just because it was The Pit and the Pendulum, and I was curious to know how they were going to kind of modernize it. But basically, what we have in the story of The Glittering Death is it is this is a case of a modern update. And when it opens, we're in a high school, I guess. It's a young woman. She's narrating it, and we kind of get her story through flashbacks, because in the beginning she's leaving work and she's kidnapped. And through flashbacks, we know that there is a man who the police are calling the judge, who is taking women. And I guess these special agents who have been tracking down the judge had come by our narrator's school to warn her, because basically it was they were saying that he targets young women, I think between the ages of 15 and 25, and that most of his victims all kind of share the same physical attributes. So they're all Caucasian. They've all got dark shoulder length hair. And so they were warning women or these young women to be careful. Basically, it was kind of, they were giving them the rundown and saying, look, there's this guy, he's abducting women. Make sure you go out in groups. Make sure you stay safe. Make sure you're aware of your surroundings, that sort of thing. And anyway, so she finds herself kidnapped, and I'm trying to decide as I go through this how much I want to really spoil, but I guess I'll just go all the way in. But basically what happens is she finds herself in a cage, and, she's calling for help. And this guy comes out who's dressed in like an executioner's hood, kind of. And, he talks to her very oddly. He'll say like things like, he calls her the accused, and he refers to himself as the judge, and saying that, you've come to answer for your crimes. I think specifically, he says her crimes are pride and lust. And that's something that the agents had referenced, saying that he picked victims based on like his ideas of the 7 deadly sins. And so that's why that's kind of his MO, I guess, is that he's putting them on their own kind of trial. And so she does a few things. First, she thinks back to, we get like flashbacks through her like memory remembering her life. But we get a lot of her trying to think about how she's going to get out of this cage and how she's going to get out of this situation. Um, and she knows from the time that when she spoke with the agents, she knows what's going to happen to her. And so we as readers know what's going to happen to her. And this, I think, is really what makes this story really effective, is that we know that one of the things the judge does to his victims is he holds them for a few days, I think into the full moon.
Mhm.
He's got some sort of like ritual going on, but basically he cuts their chest open and takes their heart out while they're still alive. And that's their punishment. So is not only is she going to die, but she's going to die in a really horrific way. And it's something that she thinks about because she's like, oh yeah, I know what's going to happen to me. And that, anyway, that's effective suspense, it's effective terror in the story. She's fed water and bread, just like in the original Pit and Pendulum, and the food and water is drugged, so she's kind of in and out of consciousness, and that's something she has to fight through. And towards the end, when she realizes that her time is drawing to a close and that the ritual or whatever this guy is doing is about to happen, we really see her starting to fight back. And first you see her telling, she goes through this whole thing saying like, this is who I am and this is who my family is. And you can tell that she's trying to personalize it, because one of the things she remembers the agent saying was that the agent says, we think this killer knows his victims and he's trying to get over his guilt by basically like disassociating himself. So she does everything she can to like remind him that she's a human. She's like, this is my name. This is who I am. This is my cat. This is my mom. This is, and it works because it throws the guy off of his game, I guess. And basically what ends up happening is she's able to fight back. And I don't know, Mel, should we go ahead and just spoil the ending of the story since we've given spoiler warning?
Yeah, I think we can. I just wanted to emphasize what you were saying there, is that even throughout the whole ordeal, she figures out on her own, plus with the information that she got from the agents, like how to kind of pick at his weaknesses. And that was one of the things I thought was most fascinating about the story. I just wanted to kind of emphasize that. Is that
Yeah.
every time he
Well,
tries to assert his weird weird view and perspective on her, that she is this like sinner, she honestly tells him that she hasn't done any of these things. And then yeah, she tries to personalize herself. And I was gonna say it humanizes her toward him, or at least what she tried to do. But I thought it was a really interesting technique to let us know more about her as well. Because from the very beginning of the story, she's already kidnapped. But through the
right.
flashbacks and through her telling all that, I mean, I was like tearing up when she's telling him all this information about her parents that she never would have said to her parents' faces at this point. About what she wants to go to college for, truly, not what she told her friends, and how she doesn't want to live away from her parents because she misses them so much. And I thought that was like, not only is it part of her arsenal to try to turn the situation and escape, but we're also seeing her come to terms with what is probably going to happen to her at this point. And I thought that was a really good way to kind of pull the reader into her thoughts in a really interesting way.
Yes. And I'm glad you said that. And I'm gonna kind of put a pin in that real quick. Because I want to come back to it. Basically what ends up happening is she does get under his skin enough and she does kind of play the game enough, that she's able to fight back just enough that she runs off. And she doesn't actually escape the house. She's being held, I think, in the guy's basement. She doesn't actually escape the house, but she makes it upstairs before he gets her again. And kind of at the 11th hour, the police come in and save her because a neighbor had actually seen her running in the upstairs of the guy's house, and she had seen him through the upstairs window. And the neighbor knew that that man lived alone. and that the neighbor thought she recognized her as the girl who had gone missing a few days before and was able to call the police and say, there's something not right with my neighbor, and get the police over there in time to save her. So that, like I said, I was debating how much we were going to spoil, but there we go. She does actually get out. But because you mentioned, Mel, that this story does such a good job at personalizing both for the judge and for us, the reader, this narrator. Her name is Laura. Because Laura does feel very much like a real person. And Mel, you mentioned that we both have had our own experiences teaching Poe. And we took that extensive Poe class in graduate school, in which I think we read everything the man ever wrote.
I think so. Yeah.
Every poem, every story, every fragment of a novel.
I might not have read Eureka. I'll just put that out there, but
but I often teach Poe in classes. Like any chance I get to sneak in a story, or definitely when I do my more horror themed courses, I teach Poe. But even if I'm just teaching something like, teaching students how to like deal with symbolism in stories or whatever, if I can pick just any story, I'll usually pick a Poe story because I enjoyed it and they enjoy it. But one of the things that we often talk about, and that almost always gets brought up when we talk about Edgar Allan Poe, and I'll just tell you the ones that I tend to teach. I tend to teach A Cask of Amontillado, The Telltale Heart. I'll teach Ligeia sometimes, or Annabelle Lee. When I'm forced to do poetry, I'll pick Annabelle Lee. But one of the things they always ask me is, they say, what was Poe's deal with women? And I understand what they're saying, because they want to know why. And then there's that problematic Poe quote of, and I'm going to butcher it, Mel, so you can correct me, but of what is it? The most beautiful thing in the world is a dying woman.
Yeah, or the most poetic, or something like that. The most because he's talking about how it works in a story, right? So like, it's
right,
the most poetic or most literary thing. Yeah, it's the death of a beautiful woman.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look up that exactly what it is, but we usually talk about that, and we'll talk about some of the things that went on in Poe's life that may have colored what he was writing, and how he kind of works through psychology and grief and trauma, and we talk about all of that. But they usually are frustrated in that the female characters that they get in Poe are either already dead and being kind of held on a pedestal by the narrator, or they're in the process of dying, or they've died and now are going to come back in some sort of horrific way. But they quickly see the theme of the dying women in Poe, and I really don't always have a great answer for them beyond this is what was going on with Poe. But I don't have many stories to point to say, oh, well, here's a really strong female character that Poe wrote. Because they're just, there's not a lot of them.
No, maybe Madeline from Fall of the House of Usher.
But well, she was the one I was thinking about too, but she's also dying, and she's also so damaged that she's not a real you know what I mean? I mean, she's got such a strange relationship with her twin brother that she's not a real character. I don't know.
Yeah,
anyway.
She's so absent in that story that the Vincent Price movie of it has to create a whole different backstory just to make her character work.
Exactly. I mean, she's basically she's an appendage to her brother at that point. But I am so glad that now when I teach some of these Poe stories that I feel like I can hand some of my students a story like The Glittering Death and be like, okay, here is a story that really nails what Poe was doing in a lot of his stories. Because even something like The Pit and the Pendulum, and there's a lot of fun illusions, the heart and the judge and
The circular saw.
right, the circular saw. I mean, there's a lot of fun, like just illusions that work. Where you can kind of point to something in the glittering death and be like, "Hey, that was in the pit and the pendulum." Like that's a fun little crossover. But one of the things that like Poe wrote about a lot, Mel, you mentioned how he writes about kind of the human monsters, and the pit and the pendulum was this idea of religion as kind of being this monstrous thing. And you kind of get the same thing. I mean, it's not religion, but it's like masculinity almost in the glittering death that's like this monstrous thing and this dangerous thing to women. But I feel like now we've got this great, like, what is very much a Poe story or in the vein of Poe, but also has just a really good, strong female character.
Who survives.
Who
Yeah.
survives. She
Yeah.
does not die. And it's so much fun.
And the other thing that's kind of interesting if you're comparing the two stories is the Pit and the Pendulum. Poe had a tendency sometimes, I guess because he was kind of using illusions and symbolism. He has stories where it's like, particularly his most fantastic ones that are taking place on like other worlds, where nobody really has any names and there's not really any story or personalization of them. They're just like doing things, like the man and the creature or whatever. And I feel like he's much more focused on his theme or the struggle, not the character per se, in those sorts of stories. And the Pit and Pendulum is kind of the same thing. When I was rereading it, I was like, this is a terrifying story, but everybody in it is faceless, even including the dude in the pit. Like, we don't know who he is or what he did that caused these people to go after him. Obviously, it's religion, like run amok, because he probably didn't do anything. But we don't know. We don't know, and we don't get much about his personality at all, except for the fact that he's just trying to survive. And of course, the people who are trying to kill him and torture him aren't even in there unless he's sedated, so we don't see them either. And so I thought, in this story, the amount of detail and the characterization that we got with Laura and the judge was like jarring if you read the Pit and the Pendulum first, because the Pit and the Pendulum is all about the themes that you were talking about: punishment and overbearing religion and that sort of thing, bald-faced fear, survival. This story, Road Rug story, is the same things, but we get a much deeper characterization, which I feel like as a reader pulls me even deeper into it.
I completely agree. I mean, that was well, I mean, I got really sucked into this story, and I remember, and then there's a lot of other, I think, allusions that are made, not just to the Poe story, but to obvious other like serial killer stories that made it a enjoyable read. I saw a lot of, oh, what's the name of the killer in The Silence of the Lambs?
Oh, Hannibal Lecter.
No, not Hannibal Lecter. The
Oh,
one that
the
they're Buffalo
Buffalo. Yeah,
Bill.
Buffalo
Yeah.
Bill.
Yeah. So
Mm.
yeah, that's why I was like, I know Hannibal Lecter. I
Yeah, I was
couldn't
gonna
think
say,
of
'cause we're talking about it before we started recording.
yeah, I just had one of those momentary, like my brain stopped working. Um yeah, I mean there's kind of a fun, like it feels a little bit Buffalo Billish at one
Mhm,
point. I guess just the fixation on the women and keeping them in a cage and not really wanting to go too close to them.
mhm,
Um and then there was also, kind of the illusions like the seven deadly sins. Obviously, I thought about the movie Seven a whole lot.
mhm.
And there were a few more that it reminded me of. I mean, real life serial killers. There was one. Was it Ted Bundy who preferred the brunettes and made every? I feel like when he was active in his killing, did I read that
He
where he
definitely had a type, yeah.
yeah he went after brunettes because it was like looked like one of his ex girlfriends and everybody was going out and dyeing their hair. Anyway, but one thing that and again that I like, so it fits in with this kind of serial killer trope, I guess, that we all recognize. But Mel, like you were talking about, it was the getting to know Laura so well that I think made this stand out. And because we got sucked into her world rather than the world of the serial killer. And that was, I think, one thing that made this story stand out from not only from the Poe Pit and the Pendulum, which I think you're absolutely right in everything you said, but also just from other serial killer stories in general. Was that we got her story so much more. Which, by the way, I did look up the Poe quote, and because I have to get this right. He said, or he wrote, that the death of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world. So that was his, and I guess he was talking about, again, grief and loss and absence, and because these women are absent a lot in his stories, but I just had to get that quote correct before we moved on.
Oh no, I'm glad you looked it up. We want to give Poe, his props and get his quotes correct.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's see. One of the things we were joking before we hit record that we started talking about these stories, and we were like, we can't do the episode without recording it. Kind of chuckling about that. But you had said that at first you thought that when she was getting rescued, that it was almost gonna be like a Deus Ex Machina kind of ending, like the end of the Pit and the Pendulum. But then it was the fact that she had tried to escape and she attracted the attention of the woman, that they were able to come. So it wasn't like they just were like, oh, we now know where he is, and like zip on in there and get her. And something that I had mentioned that we didn't really get into that much was, I said that I thought the ending was an interesting callback to the earlier part of the story, because in the earlier part of the story, when they're at the high school, I know the word in my assembly. There's a high school assembly with the agents. It's been so long since high school. I don't know what you're supposed to do. They're assembling. And Fields and Prescott are telling them, what a horrible person this is. And the kids are kind of laughing and they're not paying attention. And someone says that he's a werewolf and they're joking around. And if I remember, I'm trying to find the exact quote, but the agent says, "He is not a storybook monster. He's a man. He's flesh and blood like everyone in this room. And if you see him, you won't even know it." And that is terrifying. And we get that at the end because she saw this guy like every day at her job, but she never really saw him. Like, she never really knew what he was capable of, and she couldn't see him when he was in his executioner robe. And then the other thing at the assembly is, one of the guys that are present, like one of Laura's friends, says something to the effect of, well, should we just all lock ourselves up in our houses so nobody hurts us? And she thinks to herself about all the times she's been told, to be careful when she's alone, and make sure that you don't leave your drink unattended, and make sure people always know where you are, and make sure you're always in a well-lighted place. And, this kind of constant fear of someone attacking. As a woman, you have this constant fear that someone could attack you. And the story leaves us with that, because when the agents leave her house, she goes outside and she's looking at her neighborhood in a completely different way. She's thinking of all the places where someone could hide, like, and it ends at dusk, because she talks about, this is her boring neighborhood with all their lives left to live, and then the sun is going down. And so it's this very dark end to the story, where what the guy at the assembly was joking about unknowingly, because it's not his experience, is completely kind of like corroborated for Laura at the end of the story, because she's experienced that. I mean, as a woman reading the story, I'm kind of like, yeah, I mean, that that kind of is that is unfortunately the type of view that we have to take, or the things that we have to be thinking of. And Laura kind of learns that in a really extreme way. Again, the Pit and the Pendulum is more of like a snapshot of this guy in this prison. This opens it up in really interesting ways to even the larger society outside the story.
Yeah, it does end on a very dark note, even though she does escape. And I like what you pointed out, how the kind of beginning mirrors the ending, because that is a sinister, I mean, a sinister idea to think that there are all sorts of hidden dangers out there, especially for women, that just exist. And she had always been warned about them, you know, that the whole don't leave your drink unattended, take your phone with you at all times, make sure you go out in pairs, stay safe. But now it has a new meaning for her. And there was a point where towards the end where she talks about, now she's home and she's safe, but talks about how she's woken up screaming because she hears the whirring of that circular saw and kind of in her
Mhm.
brain always going. And I think that was one of the things too that stuck out with me was the darkness of the ending, because you realize that, I mean, it really does the whole final girl trope well, because you see that she is a survivor, she is strong, but there's she's not unscathed,
Mhm.
and she's changed by that knowledge of kind of confronting the evil that is out in the world, even though she's been warned about it her whole life. Like, there's something different about confronting it, because you're going to look at the world differently now, forever. And I thought that really stood out to me too, was how well that was handled, I thought.
Yeah, she's definitely changed by the end of the story to the point where it was unclear to me if she was saying she couldn't remember because she didn't want to keep telling the story over and over again, or if we were with her throughout the story when things were actually happening and she really does, I mean, understandably have this almost like amnesia about it. But yeah, the not being able to sleep, the not being able to remember everything that the agents would like her to remember so they would know what happened, like all of that. Definitely. And it's jarring for the reader too to all of a sudden be home with her because you really don't think that's ever going to happen. Very similarly to her.
Yeah. Well, I was worried we weren't going to find enough to talk about. But now I'm thinking we could go on our entire episode and just talk about the glittering death. So I don't know. This was a really good story, and so I don't know. I haven't read anything else by Caleb Roaring, but Roarig. Um, but now I want to. So
Yeah, the whole time I was reading all these stories, I was like writing down. If I wasn't familiar with the writer, I was looking up, okay, what is this person written? Because I need to add this to my TBR, which is now
I
even
know.
longer than it was before.
I know. These are fun stories. Well, why don't we talk about one more? And then maybe we will have whetted the appetite of our listeners and they'll want to go read the rest of the stories. But Mel, I know you had mentioned when we were talking about this, one that kept coming up was the Purloined Letter remake or reboot, or I don't know what you would call it, reimagining.
Yeah, I think you mean the story. Was it Emily Lloyd Jones's A Drop of Stolen Ink? Um, I'm not going to go through the entire Edgar Allan Poe Purloined Letter story, but the Purloined Letter was one of his mystery stories. So it was, let me see, you have the Purloined Letter and you have the Murders of the Rue Morgue, and wasn't the third one was it the Mystery of Marie Roget? Is that what it was titled, Lisa?
I
The
think
one that was
so.
based on the real crime. Um,
Yeah.
so the Purloined Letter, you have his famous detective, and he has a French name, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher it. It's Auguste Dupin, and it's like a Holmes Watson type thing, if I remember right, because you have a assistant kind of going along with him. And there's a letter with some compromising information for this particular person in a high up position. And the detective has to find it. And so everybody, people have searched this person they think is holding this letter, this information's home and office and everything. They cannot find it. They cannot find it. And the point of the story, the moral of the story, is that the best place to hide something is in plain sight. Because if you have this incriminating piece of paper and you just have it shuffled up with a bunch of other papers on your desk, nobody is going to think that that's it, because you would have stuffed it in an envelope, like in a book, or hidden it somewhere. So everybody's always looking for where it could be hidden, and it's really just like, if I remember right, just like almost stuck in a cubby hole. It might even, I think Lisa, you might have mentioned something about it's like folded differently or something. I think he folded differently so the guy knows he found it. Anyway, so that's the moral of the story. So, A Drop of Stolen Ink by Emily Lloyd Jones. The first thing that I thought was so cool about it is that it has like a sci-fi, like almost Blade Runner type aspect to it, but it's also like a spy story, and I love a good spy story. So I thought that was a really cool take on it. But Lisa, I know you said this was one that you really enjoyed too.
It was. And yeah, we'll go ahead, and when you were talking about the Purloined Letter, the original, and Poe's detective Auguste Dupin. He is, you mentioned Sherlock Holmes, so he was the predecessor to Sherlock Holmes. He was really the first of that type of, I don't know if you'd call it a genius detective, but Poe basically invented the detective story with the Dupin stories. But because Dupin's thing, like Sherlock Holmes later, was he was able to outsmart everybody. He was able to solve the crime because he was smarter than everybody else and could kind of see things that other people would miss. And I love a good whodunit. And if I were going to rewrite the Purloined Letter, I probably would have or I would have attempted to do like a traditional whodunit, a Clue, a Knives Out, something along those lines, right? This was so unexpected, and I think that's one of the things that I did love about the story, because Mel, when you described it as like Blade Runner, that was exactly it. It's if somebody took Sherlock Holmes and Blade Runner and mashed them together in a blender, and it were.
And then there was like James Bond and M like popped in.
Yeah, it's so much fun because it is a spy, like it's a detective story, because there is basically what's going on is that it's identity theft. It's a case of identity theft. Because it's in a futuristic world where everybody has their identities tattooed on their skin. And there's a very special, like, government issued electron ink that is used to prevent people from stealing other people's identities. And apparently tattoos are used a lot in this future, because I don't know if I got this exactly right, but this is the way I read it. You can use, like, companies can tattoo you so that you can use that as like your credentials for the business, and that will like unlock doors and things like that. But then there's also the separate, like, your official government issued ID. So I think that's the issue, is that there's two different types of ink that can be used, but everybody wants this like government ink, because that's how you can essentially become somebody else. And that's the beginning part of the story, is we have a detective / spy who has been sent in to this company to figure out who stole this important tattoo, I guess. Is that
Mhm.
making sense? Am I making sense? I'm just
Yeah, and the compromising material is still there because we find out that a politician who was high up, it's kind of implied, it's like a president or a prime minister or whatever, has a special tattoo that helps them like see all the things that they would need to see, right? Like the tip top security clearance. And that person, um, had the federal government make a copy, which is supposed to be impossible for a mistress, so that she could have access to his office. And then this guy Duval, who works for this company that Augusta Pine is, nice little turn on the name there,
yeah.
is investigating, has taken it. So I guess so he could use it to access the secrets, or probably sell it to get the secrets.
Right.
Um, and so
Yeah.
she's got to find it. And all these other people have searched and searched and they couldn't find it. So now they're sending her in.
Yeah, and again, I like it, it sounds very complicated, but when you think about it, it makes complete sense to me because it's like, okay, the government decided, identity theft was becoming too much of a problem, so they've invented this kind of, special ink tattoo. That was very believable to me. And then the fact that, a high-ranking official would breach that system just so his mistress could come and go as she pleased without other people knowing what was happening. Um, Again, that kind of made me laugh as I was reading it because I thought, no, that's exactly how that would happen. You know, that's exactly how it would happen, and that's what people complain about. I mean, even going back to like Marilyn Monroe and the Kennedys, right?
Hmm.
They're saying, oh well, it's dangerous for these beautiful women, mistresses because who knows what kind of state secrets they're privy to, in pillow talk or something like that. Um, but yeah, and so he has duplicated, I guess, this tattoo and this special ink for his mistress, and then now that has been stolen by this Duval character, who now everybody's trying to figure out what he's done with it. Um, and yeah, you're right. It was clever because first we get Augusta Pine. So she is the detective slash spy that's narrating the story and that we kind of follow throughout. And I really enjoyed this because number one, it's fun seeing the Sherlock Holmes character, the Dupin character, be turned not just into a woman, but isn't she a teenage girl? I mean, that was how I read her. Was I wrong in that?
I think so. I mean, I read her. I cannot remember if she actually says how old she is because that's not her real name. She, she is a hacker, and this is like she talks at one point like it's like community service, but let me see what she's telling Adriana about it. Basically, the gist is she was trying to impress this boy, I guess, and she like hacked into the car because everybody's car like runs on
They're
program.
self-driving cars, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And she hacks into it and accidentally makes the car crash in this reservoir and kills him and also kills her. So she is what they call a wraith. So she is someone who she died for a little bit and they managed to reconstruct her body enough to bring her back. And then as punishment, she has to work for the government for a certain amount of time using her skills. So yeah, I got the impression that she was like maybe 20 max, but I can't remember if she says how old she is because if she can crack this case, they're going to send her back to her family and her old life. So I'm wondering if she said how old she was at some point and I just missed it.
Yeah, I was looking through that. I was looking back through the story to see. I always kind of read her as well. I mean, we know she's an intern. We know she was young when the car crash happened,
Mm-hmm.
and she had only lived out like I guess 4 years of her community service that she was supposed to give them
Mm-hmm.
at this point. Um, So yeah, maybe a 20 at most would be good, but I don't think it ever says. Either way, let's just stop and appreciate this for a moment. So we've already talked because I wanted to bring out the fact that Poe's detective is basically Sherlock Holmes. Like he was the predecessor to Sherlock Holmes. I bring that up because we all know, and we know who Sherlock Holmes is. He's way too smart. He knows everything. He's able to come in and assess things and put together puzzles that other people can't. And he's a little bit of a savant when it comes to things like that, right? And to put that, because she is very smart, and that's one of the things she talks about. She says that's the only reason I'm alive right now is because they want my brain. Basically, I have this near genius intelligence and an ability to hack into things, and that's what they wanted. That's the only reason I'm alive right now. I still just love seeing that character in the body of a teenage girl because that is just something we do not see a lot of. And that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and there's no pausing or wondering why this is happening. It just starts like this romp and it just continues. Like, okay, this is our hero. Let's go. Let's do this.
Absolutely. Well, and as far as her ability to like solve the crime, it plays out very much like you would expect a whodunit. A very clever detective solving a whodunit because she's able. We just kind of basically as the reader, we're just following her through this, and then we have to leave it up to her at the end to explain what happened to it. You're just kind of following her going, okay, when is she gonna explain where all this fits? And she does. I mean, at the end she meets with her, well, she calls him prefect, but basically her like handler, I guess. The guy who like hands out her things, and she basically, that's when she, for the prefect and for us the reader, she like says, oh yeah, this is where the tattoo was the whole time and this is what happened. And she just very easily rolls out how she solved the case. And I love it. Like there was no apologies on her part for being like, oh, sorry, I'm just a little 18-year-old girl here. But I don't know, I liked it.
Well, I thought it was, and I mean, you just kind of need this for the story to work. But she also has that moment where she realizes she can only rely on herself because even though Prefect has tried to take care of her, he's still given orders. And I mean, I guess I'll go ahead and spoil it, but it's the tattoo is hidden in plain sight on the, I think she's the administrative assistant, and she strikes up a relationship with the administrative assistant or tries to start a friendship with her, so that and then she figures it out, and she has this moment where she realizes that Adriana is going to get in trouble, and so she figures out a way to give Prefect what he wants so she can get out, but she also gives Adriana the agency to get Duval to cut her loose if she wants to. And I thought that was a really cool twist. So the two women kind of get to win at the end.
Yeah. I mean, they're given everything. Basically. I mean, she solves a crime. She's able to walk away and she's able to kind of save the day and give Adriana, who, I don't know, Adriana is the closest thing we get, I guess, to a real victim in this story. Because she's the one who has, I guess, the most to lose, and she's also the innocent bystander in a lot of it. She was just interning and working for the wrong man, basically. But yeah, she's given a chance to live a different life too, which is nice.
And a nice twist, it involves hacking a car again because she feels terrible for when she hacked the car to impress the guy so they can skip school. And then she ends up hacking the bad guy's car in order to protect Adriana. I thought that was an interesting touch, because once she's making that friendship with Adriana, which at the end is hinted is going to become more, so she also gets a relationship at the end. But the more they get to know each other, the more we see her and how she's been struggling with this horrible thing that happened to her in her past. Like, they not only resurrected her to use her skills, but by resurrecting her, they've also forced her to continually punish herself because of the horrible guilt that she feels. Like, she's forced to have survivor's guilt, kind of, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's really painful.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
her
this,
family thinks she's dead too.
that I was just about to bring that up because that was one of the things about the story that really struck me. I mean, beyond just the that she had been through this tragedy and she was still dealing with the fact that she felt like, well, that she had killed somebody. But when it came out that her family thought she was dead, and I thought that really struck something deep in my core, and made her stand out as a real character too, because not only was she fighting to get her life back. I don't know. I don't even know if I can talk about it, because just thinking about like what that must do to somebody to know that for 4 years, not only can you not go back to your old life, not only, is all that gone, and you're having, I mean, essentially to live as a prisoner, assume a different identity, and but to feel like to have to live with that guilt of knowing what you're putting your family through and not being able to reach out to them and tell them that, hey, I'm okay. Like, to know that her parents are back home going through the absolute worst thing imaginable, and to know that she has to sit there with that knowledge. I mean, it was heavy, I thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she
But
truly is a
again,
ghost.
right. Yeah. Um, and I thought that was something that a lot of these kind of spy genre stories don't deal with very well. Because a lot of times they tend to focus on what makes the story glamorous, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Or even a lot of it we've mentioned, like Sherlock Holmes, which isn't exactly a spy story, but that we tend to kind of glamorize, well, oh, he's the man who can walk in and kind of assess everything and solve the crime really easily. But very rarely are those stories looking at the humanity behind all that, or like a James Bond type, if we want to stick with the spy genre.
Yeah, it's very much plot and results oriented and not that kind of
Yeah.
pausing for the human effect. Yeah.
Right.
And the
So
fact that
yeah,
she
I like
cares for
that.
Adriana and wants to help her also changes the way that she approaches the case as well, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah, I liked their relationship, Adriana's and Augusta's, as it developed. It was a really, it was a nice one. And I liked the fact too that they were both interns in this company, because you did get this idea that, I mean, they well, and this was probably part of it with Adriana and Duval, but Duval absolutely saw her as somebody who's disposable.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that Augusta did not see her in that way, it was nice. And that was probably what allows Augusta to work well as a spy too, is because a man like Duval would look at her as invisible or disposable in the same way that he looked at Adriana that way. But then they had this own kind of little micro relationship. Like when there was one scene, and this says nothing about like the spy or the tattoo or anything that was going on in the story, but where they were sitting there talking about the food.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it was over lunch when they met, and Adriana kind of makes a comment because she's brought her lunch from home, and Augusta says something along the lines of like, "Did your parents teach you, or do you know how to cook?" And she's like, "Yeah, my parents made sure I knew how to do that." Um, I don't know. It was such a real moment of connection between the two of them, and that's what I one of the things that I thought made this story really well rounded. That you don't often see, like I said, in that kind of spy story.
Yeah, I want the sequel of Adriana and Augusta out like doing some cool adventures.
I agree. Well, I guess she's not Augusta anymore, though.
Oh, that's true. She doesn't tell us what name she's going by though at the end, does she?
No, it just says that she saw a name that she hadn't seen in 4 years. So I mean, she's given her old identity back,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't know what she does with it. Um,
Well, and I love that end where Adriana is like, she says, "I feel weird knowing the tattoo is there. I could get up to all kinds of mischief with it." And Augusta says, "You could." And she says, "We could," as if all sorts of bad ideas were occurring to her. Her use of the plural made me smile. I mean, it's a great relationship that's built there. Yeah, I want to see him go get into some trouble or bust some bad guys.
oh yeah. I kind of feel like at that point, yeah. I don't know. Maybe we'll see more of Augusta and Adriana. Um, maybe they'll be like the new Holmes and Watson.
Mm. Netflix, make us an Adriana and Augusta show.
I really feel that way. I'm like I mean, well, this was written by Emily Lloyd Jones, and she was another one that I haven't read any of her other things before, and so now I'm really curious to do it because I'm like you. I'm like, but wait a minute. I mean, really, Netflix, make us this show, and if not, then Miss Lloyd Jones, please write more.
It was fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, we're not going to have time to talk about this story, but the last story in the collection, The Murders in the Rue Apartel by Rin Chupeco, is another take on Poe's detective stories that is really interesting and different. It takes a story in really cool directions. So, but I know we could talk about one story for like an entire episode. So,
Yeah, we really could. And like I said, we just picked a couple of these. I think because these were just the ones we were already talking about, but there were lots more on our favorites list. So, but we don't want to spoil too many too many of them. And I feel like the two that we talked about, The Glittering Death and A Drop of Stolen Ink, even though we kind of gave you the rundown of the story, those are both the kind of stories that the unfolding of what happens is almost more important than what happens. So I don't think by knowing the plot, it has ruined anything for it.
no, I don't think so either. And we kind of just talked about the plot in our discussion. We didn't really go through it chronologically. So the other neat aspect of both of these stories, well, all the stories in the book, is just kind of seeing how they're put together and structured. So yeah, I think you could easily read the two that we talked about and not feel spoiled or not feel like your experience was ruined by our talking about them.
No.
I hope folks check this book out and really enjoy it because I thought it was fun. I thought it was a fun exercise that led to some really cool stories.
I completely agree. Poe is always enjoyable to read. Poe will always be among my favorite writers, but I mean, we know that there are some serious problems with some of his stories, especially when you read them with modern eyes. And so it is fun to see new writers um, take on some of his tales and kind of reimagine them and cast new characters and themes that probably could have never been written at the time Poe was writing. So that's been a lot of fun. But I'm like you. I hope our readers will go out. So I guess we'll leave you with this. If you are a fan of Edgar Allan Poe, and there's a good chance you are if you're listening to this podcast, then Mel and I both highly recommend the collection His Hideous Heart, 13 of Edgar Allan Poe's most unsettling tales reimagined. And that's edited by Dahlia Adler. You can get it from Flatiron Books. This is just a reminder that your co-hosts, Lisa and Mel, wrote a nonfiction book about women who have written horror and dark speculative fiction titled Monster She Wrote. You can get your copy by going to the Quirk Books website or through any major book retailer. We'd love to hear from you. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram, and we have a Facebook page. If you'd like to contact us by email, and we love getting emails, feel free to send us a note at nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we are doing, consider supporting us on Patreon and get access to exclusive content. Or you can simply rate and review us, which is entirely free and helps other listeners find us. Thanks for listening, and we will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.